to think much longer term, suddenly it's like they're not spending money on frivolous things. They're not buying stuff that they don't need. They're very much thinking about the future because they know that they can preserve their wealth and that it's not going to be taken away from them. If you know that your wages are just being devalued, so the wage that you got this month, in a few days' time is going to be worth less, of course you might as well spend the money and buy stuff.
Welcome to the Rose Show podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. Today I'm here with Krista Edmunds. She's a Bitcoin educator, podcaster, and writer. She's a creator. She's a founder at Access Tribe Limited, and she's also co-founder at Bitcoin Policy UK. How you doing today, Krista?
I'm really well. Thanks so much for having me on, Ro. It's lovely to chat to you.
It's lovely that you're here. Thank you so much, Krista. So you are making a difference in the Bitcoin community. You're advocating for others. You're enlightening. You're educating. You're a voice for women in Bitcoin. Amazing stuff you're doing. And, it's important that we think different, we invest different, and we think differently about money. And education is key. And that's at the center of everything. So before we get into your amazing new projects that you've been working on, Krista, could you tell us about your background? I know you have over 2 decades of expertise in the financial markets and innovation.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm bringing my whole Bitcoin Barbie self to the interview.
The Barbie.
Very non-traditional finance. But yeah, so I had 20 years in traditional financial markets. So I started my career at Bloomberg and I worked on the help desk there, which back in the day was where everybody started. So that was doing trading system support. So for people who were trading electronically on the Bloomberg platform. And when I left Bloomberg, I was working for their brokerage sales for equity and FX services that they were providing. And then I went to what was ICAP for 4 years. So that's an interdealer broker that no longer exists. It's been bought out by Tullets. But if you can imagine, if you've seen the movie Wolf on Wall Street, it was basically like that. That movie is extremely accurate and very funny, but it was very relatable for me. And then I went to Barclays after that, who were a client of mine at ICAP, and spent 11 years there, 5 of them in the UK. And then I moved to New York, not to Wall Street, actually up to Midtown, because that's where the offices were. And I spent 3 years working in the sales division and then moved into corporate innovation for 3 years and ran their accelerator program and the innovation team that was covering the businesses on the US side. So it was quite a long ride before I got to my Bitcoin journey.
Absolutely. But you came with a wealth of experience in the financial markets, innovation, and technology. So how more appropriate than that to come to Bitcoin, which is the center of technology, innovation, and the future of money, or some say it's money today. Definitely a global reserve asset. So I know you're also an advocate for women in Bitcoin. Tell us about that and your motivation for creating that.
Yeah, I mean, the two things kind of wove together, really. So when I was working in TradFi, I started this program for women at the bank, and it was a global program that I run, which was educating women on board participation. So it was basically sessions just to teach them about how, what skills they needed to sit on a board. And it was really interesting to me because I just thought, there's so many jobs out there that people are qualified to do, but they don't realize that they have the skill set. Like sitting on a board is not rocket science. And actually, you can teach those skills fairly easily to anyone. And that got me kind of incubating this idea for a careers app. I was sort of thinking, if people had a better understanding of what the opportunities were out there, and then they had a means to gain the skills, they would, potentially change careers or look at different options in a much more open way. And when I left the bank, I moved to Canada. So I was living in New York, moved to Canada, and I kind of got to a point I just thought, I don't want to do the same thing. I want to pivot my career and I'd like to look at some other options. And I had a bunch of colleagues who had left and they'd all gone to crypto companies. And so weirdly, it was actually my mum who orange pilled me, as they say. And she is not a Bitcoiner, but she's really interested in Jordan Peterson. She listens to all of his podcasts. She thinks he's great. And I sort of said to her, I really want to look at this crypto space because, so many of my colleagues are moving into it. Seems like a hot new area. Being in corporate innovation, I thought that it'd be really interesting to look at. And so she sends me this podcast and she said, oh, Jordan Peterson interviewed 4 Bitcoiners the other day. You should listen to this. And she hadn't listened to it. And I thought, that's strange. He's a clinical psychologist. Why is he talking to Bitcoiners? And so she sends me this thing and I watch it, and it's 90 minutes long. If anyone wants to watch it, it's called The Future of Money. And it has Robert Breedlove, Dajiji, who's the pseudonymous Bitcoiner, John Vallis, and the filmmaker, the Australian filmmaker, Richard James. And I watched this thing and it was 90 minutes long and it just completely blew my mind. I was like, I've spent 20 years in financial markets. I understand nothing about money. But in those 90 minutes, the litany of questions that I had about the nonsense that was TradFi, like traditional finance, suddenly just everything fell into place. And I was like, oh my God, this is why like inflation doesn't make any sense. This is why all of these layers of products that you're constantly chasing yield on don't make sense. And like the whole financial market is basically just this kind of race against inflation and a race to try and get yield. And it just creates all these layers and layers of problems. So anyway, I fell down the rabbit hole pretty damn hard. Became just absolutely obsessed with the topic, listened to all the podcasts I could listen to. I did a course in, I think it was March last year. So I sat a 3-week course, Anthony Pompliano's crypto course. I met a whole bunch of Bitcoin maxis there. So, got very deep involved into the space. And what was going to be a careers app morphed more and more into kind of like, I was exploring tokenization, a crypto space. And then one of my maxi tutors on the Pompliano course sat me down and he said, why the heck are you building this tokenized platform? Like, just do it with Bitcoin and use the Lightning Network. And I was like, damn, you're right. Actually, I can't answer the question properly as to why this thing should be tokenized. So anyway, it kind of evolved and evolved. And then I joined a UK company as their community manager who was standing up the first Bitcoin conference for the UK, or Bitcoin only conference. And that was just a wild ride. I met so many Bitcoiners, got to know the space really well. And then my company Access Tribe just morphed more and more into this space. And people kept saying to me, look, there aren't enough women in this space. Your background's in doing all of this stuff to bring women into various different areas. Why don't you just focus more on that? And I had so many women just interested generally to learn about Bitcoin that I started doing training sessions and then just kind of incorporated all of this into Access Tribe. So that's kind of the origin story, I guess, of Access Tribe.
That's so awesome. What I gather from that is that here you saw that Jordan Peterson interview and your mom introduced you to that, is she a Bitcoiner?
I mean, not really. No, she's watched it now, but not really. I mean, she's an economist actually by training, so it's quite funny that she hasn't got quite as enthusiastic about it. But I guess when you're retired and you're just like, yeah, I've got my quiet life. She listens to my podcast, but
that's nice.
Other than that, I wouldn't say she.
Yeah, that's so nice. So okay, so you go down the rabbit hole. You love the story. You feel that's the solution. That's something that it's necessary for our system and money. And we're going to talk about what is money. And that's important concept to go over. But then you said, okay, this is the way. This is amazing. And not only do I want to go down this path, but I want to help others. And I want to enlighten these other people, women, that aren't fully aware of the opportunities that lie ahead. And I always like to say the challenges always bring forth opportunities. We just have to look for them. And it's those opportunities to help us find the solutions. And so, okay, this is great. So it's like the allegory of the cave with Plato. He talks about, the people seeing the shadows on the wall. Here you are, you woke up, you saw the truth, you saw what was really going on, and you said, you know what, instead of me just leaving this cave, I'm going to enlighten these people. Very nice, very noble, Krista. So what is money? What was the impression you had before Bitcoin when you worked at Barclays, at Bloomberg, and all these other financial companies? What was your impression of money, and what do you see is money, the light that you see now that you've woken up? What is money to you now?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because you probably know, like Bitcoiners talk a lot about what is money, and they talk about it being, a store of value, a medium of exchange, and so on. And I guess, I mean, I never gave it a lot of deep thought, if I'm really honest. I mean, it's crazy. I mean, I worked in the FX space and I never really sat there and deeply considered the question, what is money, which is wild. Um, but to me, it was almost like a river that was just sort of flowing around the system, and it's like the lubricant between, the means of exchange or, being able to store your wealth. I remember actually one really interesting conversation or one anecdote that stuck in my mind when I was at Bloomberg. They used to give us a lot of economics training. And I was in this class and the teacher was talking about inflation. And I asked her and I said, look at the crux of it. Like, why does inflation exist? And I just remember her turning around and looking at me and going, well, it's because people just keep wanting more money. They want to get paid more. So people get paid more, then prices go up. Um, and it's just so wild how off that was, because at no point in those 20 years did anyone talk about how much money the government was printing that it was not taking in on taxes. And so I think once you understand that money is like this pie, and if you keep adding to the pie, then everybody's piece, I mean, maybe a pie is a bad example, but if you keep adding to the pie, everybody's piece of the pie gets smaller and smaller, and therefore your wages de facto go down. You then suddenly start to understand like all of the knock-on effects on society and how these impact they permeate everything in our lives, our education system, our working system, like how people are paid, the wages, how they store their wealth, how they, prepare for retirement, how they fund their kids' college. Like it just permeates absolutely everything. And I pulled up some stats, by the way, just to quote to you about women in the Bitcoin space and also in the financial space. So it was interesting because when I started delving into this, I was like, like according to Google, this is a 2021 stat, so it's a little bit out of date, but there were about 14.23% or rather, the engagement that Google sees on Bitcoin content is about 14.23% women, which is crazy. I can speak for having worked in the Bitcoin space that when you have conferences or events, it's somewhere around 10% of the attendees are women. And then when you look at it, it's like when you look at engagement on just in general on the internet, you look at Google stats, about 1%. And it's crazy to me because I got these numbers, by the way, from a bunch of different sources. So this is a stat from Forbes. Women make up more than half of the US population and control or influence 85% of consumer spending, 85%. Federal Reserve stat, women control more than 60% of all the personal wealth in the US. So that's very likely also their children's inheritance planning. And I'm sure you're extremely well versed on this as well. US Bureau of Labor statistics, approximately 40% of US working women now out earn their husbands. So women are actually an economic powerhouse. Certainly in the US, but that also plays out across the world where they don't have kind of restrictions on what they're able to do. And the crazy thing in the Bitcoin space is sort of I came from TradFi, and in TradFi, we are awash with women's groups that are addressing the glass ceiling. Why is it that women can't get promoted? Why are they not, progressing in their careers to the same degree that men are? And they're all spending time in these groups and these various committees. Meantime, over here in the Bitcoin space, like generational wealth is being built. So the men that are in this space building, they're the Elon Musks of the future, they're the Mark Zuckerbergs, they're the ones that are going to be making billions, and they're building really, really interesting businesses. But that diversity and that roundedness that really gives you strength and resilience and creates a good product is missing because the women are largely absent. And they're just kind of sitting in this TradFi world, moaning about the state of the world. And I look at it and I'm like, you're focusing on what is a crumbling economic system. I don't know whether you agree with me, but I just think that that world is not going to look the way that it does in like 20 years' time, 10 years' time. Why focus your energy in here? I mean, it's just crazy. And I think a lot of it comes down to this issue of not understanding what money is, not understanding that you're in this kind of rat race to try and protect your wealth, your kids' wealth, and provide for your family. And you just don't understand that money is being stolen for you systematically as the government prints more and more fiat currency or money as we know it, like the US dollar. So I think women being such a huge controlling force, I guess, in the economy, are really the ones that like need to wake up to this and actually should care about this way more than men should. Like it really should be front and center of their mind. So I think that question should be asked by everybody, like what the heck is money? And, you know, why is the system so screwed?
Exactly. I like that. You know, we can go back to, there's several points there that, you know, we could talk about this exponential quest. It's like we have this quest for more and more growth. It's because we're always fighting against the system, which I think the US dollar right now, Saifedean, as well as Michael Saylor said about, we're losing about 7% yearly, even though they say the inflation rate is currently around 3 to 4% year over year. You know, you have to factor in a lot of other parts to that. And so it's losing its value, inflation. And then we also have that the money system is actually created, 85% of the money system is created through commercial banks and lending. And that's how they, you could say, minted money, or that's how the money is created rather than just central banks printing. It's through the lending. Fiat is based on a debt system. And so with that in mind, we know that we need to be growing at about, I'd say 10% per year. It's like we're always constantly having to grow at this 10%. That's a lot of growth. Double-digit growth is significant to not be losing value. So you got that going for it. And then we have massive debt. We know US had about 32 trillion, plus it's increasing every month with the ERC. And that number is only going to go higher. We got downgraded with Finch. So now our interest expense is even higher. I think it's estimated about 1 trillion. And rates are going to stay higher for longer as we see Powell, you know, this is I'm talking about US. We see Powell staying very hawkish. We know rates are going to be higher, and that's going to cause a lot of issues going forward. And we see longer term rates, the 10-year, 30 years going up now. Very concerning issues going on there. And so, and you know, I think we're in for a secularly inflationary period up ahead. I think we have challenges probably for the next, you know, 5-10 years forward, and then we'll see what happens after that. But I think we need to find solutions, and Bitcoin is incorruptible. It has a finite supply of 21 million. And so I think there's a strong case for a global reserve asset, and as well as currency. And you know, the Lightning Network on layer 2 is fantastic. And I just recently spoke with someone who has a payment system, and I got to learn in depthly about the Lightning Network. Amazing stuff where you could do on-chain, which is
was that Jose from Ibex?
Isn't he so sweet? He's wonderful, right? I love him.
They're incredible.
Absolutely. He's amazing what he's doing with Ibex Pay and the Ibex Hub. And so he taught us all about Lightning Network. It was really amazing stuff. And it actually works with Visa, MasterCard. It doesn't have to, it can make it actually, Fiat and Lightning can merge and they help each other. So it's great. Just like the philosophy of Bitcoin, it's that everyone's helping each other. It's not as much of a zero sum. It's more of an abundance mindset. So it's like everything helps. And as Bitcoin goes further out, it's like, oh, that's another thing. Michael Saylor had said this. If you take your Bitcoin with you when you die, you're actually doing better for the rest of Bitcoin. It's an interesting concept. So once again, it goes with our mindset. So we're sort of conditioned to think in a certain way. Just like I said before, fiat is like based on a credit system. And so we think differently about things. So we sort of need to shift our thinking, and education is key, and being aware of these situations.
I would agree. I would agree. I mean, the stunning thing is that, like, when you consider, and I use myself as an example, the vast majority of people in TradFi just don't really understand money, or they're very wedded to this kind of, you know, money market theory ideology that inflation is good and money printing is good. I mean, I've heard people parrot this who are qualified economists. You know, they work in financial markets, they're traders. This isn't just a lack of kind of intelligence or a lack of understanding. it's literally just that's the received wisdom and people don't question it. And I think you're right. I mean, I think that coming from a corporate innovation background, I mean, I am very excited generally by new technology. For the most part, I'm a kind of technology optimist. I'm not one of these doomsayers. And I think that when people understand Bitcoin, when they really understand it, when the penny drops, I don't know a single person that really gets it that hasn't become an extremely vocal advocate of it. Um, but I think that for some people that the kind of misinformation that goes around, like, oh, it's a scam. I've had conversations with people where you mention Bitcoin and the first thing they'll say is, oh, it's a scam. Or if you talk to people in traditional finance, they'll say, oh, I can't bring that up at the bank or at the asset manager because, you know, that word is just, I will not be allowed to do anything. I won't be invited to meetings. And so what you hear a lot is terminology like blockchain. And blockchains typically, unless it's a Bitcoin blockchain, they don't really have huge benefits. They're just a digital ledger, but it doesn't have the immutability. It doesn't have the finite supply. It doesn't have the decentralization. I think for the most part, people, I'd say 99% of the world's population will benefit hugely from Bitcoin. The challenge is that the quintillionaires who sit next to the money printer that benefit from the excessive printing of money, you know, have quite a nice deal right now. And those are the people whose lifestyles will be adjusted because they are not going to be, if they're not generating value, they're not going to be compensated for it. And they're going to fight pretty hard to control Bitcoin or to stop it from getting, you know, traction. I personally think that that's a you know, fruitless task. I think to a large extent Bitcoin is inevitable, but I do think that that journey of resistance is going to happen. And I think when people start to understand it and it becomes more accepted and just generally more used, that mindset will start to shift for sure. I just think we're about to go through that very difficult transition period of they fight you, which is probably about where we are now.
I agree. I think there's going to be challenges ahead, and that's why we have to maintain strong and we have to educate and make more people aware. And that's the point of this podcast, as your amazing podcast. You know, Bitcoin changes our mindset from, well, I'll just start with fiat. Fiat incentivizes more of short-termism, and we're focused more on the short term rather than long term. I think another issue is our economic system, the Keynesian economics. It focuses more on the spending, and aggregate demand is the main driver of growth and stability. And actually, public debt is harmful for the future. And so it encourages all this mass spending.
I mean, I was going to say, do you know what's crazy about it is when you hear the environmentalists talk about overconsumption. And I think Jeff Booth has actually like challenged people about this publicly and said, explain to me how an economy that requires perpetual growth, ergo you have to make a load more products, is compatible with sustainability objectives that are saying basically consume less. It's completely nonsensical. And it's interesting to note, I mean, you've probably seen this with people when they discover Bitcoin and they, you know, tend to think much longer term. Suddenly it's like they're not spending money on frivolous things. They're not buying stuff that they don't need. They're very much thinking about the future because they know that they can preserve their wealth and that it's not going to be taken away from them. If you know that your wages are just being devalued, so the wage that you got this month, you know, in a few days' time is going to be worth less, of course you might as well spend the money and buy stuff. You know, that's what you're going to do. And, you know, then you get on the flip side, environmentalists saying, well, you know, people are buying too many clothes. They're buying a new car every year. Well, yeah. But if they didn't feel the need to do that because they knew that their money would be worth more if they held on to it, that just encourages a very different way of thinking. It's one of the magical, mystical things to me about Bitcoin that you can almost take anything in life, any problem. And I know it's that kind of funny phrase, but it's true. Bitcoin fixes this. It just does. You know, it stops people being over consuming. It allows you to preserve your wealth. I mean, you must know this as a mother. It allows you to preserve your kids' wealth. Like the idea that you can now save for their future, and either you give them the inheritance of the Bitcoin you've saved, or to Sailor's point, you just take it with you, and then everybody else's is worth more because now there's less pieces of the pie, and the pie has got smaller. But you know, that's a wild concept when you think about it. If you tried to do that in history, you'd have a pile of gold before we had fiat money, and you would have to somehow find a way to protect that gold or that castle or that building. Now your kids can carry 12 words in their head and preserve their wealth ad infinitum and just pass it on to their kids, and it just becomes more and more valuable with time. Like the abundance that will create and the lack of waste that it will, drive is really just phenomenal. It's phenomenal.
Yes, well said. We have a lot of waste. We do, and we overconsume. And yeah, it's like that fear it's going to be running out or it's going to be losing its value. So might as well spend and enjoy now while, instead of next year, which we may have less. It's like fiat has changed our thinking, it's just conditioned us that way. And debt is a drug. If we have the capability to spend, we just keep spending. It's just human nature. And yeah, we can be disciplined, of course, but it's still a challenge. And less is more. And I like to, it's analogous to all areas of our life, even with food, they try to sell us all these different diets, right? They say, oh, the low fat diet, the low carb, the whole food. I mean, I think that's healthy, but eating vegan or this or that, all these different diets, when ultimately it's about eating less. And instead of we were just over consumers and we just keep spending and overeating and over everything. And we just need to have less. And when I asked Jose, Lightning, Ibex Pay, about what if, I gave him, he's like, play devil's advocate. So I was like, okay. I'm like, so what if I want to buy something and I don't have the money? What do I do then? He's like, well, we don't have debt. There's no debt in the Lightning Network. He's like, you can, if you have use, Visa, MasterCard and want to work through them. And I was like, that's really nice. It's, you only spend what you have. And then you start if you only can spend what you have to spend, maybe you'll start thinking, I don't really need all that. I don't need all this excess, right? So we become less wasteful, because if you think about it, in America and anywhere, when you buy too much, you end up not really using it all. Have you noticed that?
Oh, 100%. Yeah. I mean, the crazy thing is, like, to give mortgages as an example. So many people don't know this, but when you go to the bank and you take a mortgage out, it's not like the bank has the cash sat in a vault somewhere and they just go, oh, here's your $300,000 mortgage or whatever for the house that you want to buy. They just essentially digitally create it, a line item. They make a loan to you with money they didn't have. They just create it out of thin air. And then they take a percentage of that, obviously, as payments. So you work to make your repayments. And by the way, if you miss your payments, they seize your asset with money that they have lent you that they created out of nowhere. But you have to work for that money to pay the bank back for the money that it created from nowhere. So that's just for you as an individual. That's the situation that you end up in with a mortgage. But then there's the wider knock-on effect on the monetary system. Now that they've created that $300,000, that goes into the monetary system. So now that dilutes everybody else's wealth. And sure, one mortgage, no big deal. 300,000 in the entire US economy is not a big deal. But when you're talking about hundreds of thousands of people taking out mortgages, all that cash goes into the system, and now everybody else's money is worth less. So now you've got that's your second problem that you've created. The third problem you've created now is that, like, the supply dwindles, because suddenly everybody's got this borrowed money to go out and buy a house. So what happens to house prices? Supply remains more or less the same. House prices go through the roof. And now you've got your wealth, that is your cash wealth, that's being devalued the whole time. So you're like, well, I can't leave my money in the bank because it's worth less every day that it sits there. So I'm going to take it out and I'm going to put it into a mortgage and I'm going to buy a house because that house is going up in value. But that entire cycle is just completely fictitious. Like, the house is not inherently more valuable. It's only valuable because this money has washed into the system that's now driving up prices and decreasing, the purchasing power that everybody has. And so, because people don't get educated about this, sure, as an individual, you might say, well, I exist in the fiat system and that's how it works. So it doesn't make sense for me not to get a mortgage because I need to protect my wealth somehow. But how crazy is it that that's how the system works? And it drives me nuts when I see politicians on TV saying we need to build more houses. And I'm like, we don't have a housing shortage. We have empty housing lying all over the place. What we have is just an excess of people buying property as investments because their money's being devalued. let's at least tell the truth about what this situation is. So all of these things just create this incredibly dysfunctional system. And the wild idea that you've just got 30,000 lines of code, which is the Bitcoin code, that allows you to exit that matrix and that craziness. And I think the day that that light switch goes on for people and they realize it, oh my God. I mean, you're sat there looking around at everybody else, who's not being orange pilled in the world and going, like, it's like talking to crazy people. So yeah, and again, I go back to the fact that I think this is something that women should care about. I mean, damn, this is so important. It's so important. So yeah, I think we will get there eventually. And I say this always, everybody will be a Bitcoiner someday. They just don't know it yet. So people think of Bitcoiners as this kind of like very crazy out there community, but I'm like, you all are going to be operating on this system. The only difference is how early you get in and how quickly you start building that generational wealth. And damn, like, do it now. Just get off zero, $100, $200, not financial advice.
Yeah. I think
But
that, yeah, it's separate. We need to differentiate Bitcoin from the rest of crypto, the shit coins they're called and everything else. And, because of all that occurred the past recent few years, it's made the whole movement and everything look negatively. But Bitcoin is different, and it's a different asset class than the rest. And I think that's how people need to start separating it. And I think it has differentiated itself. And I like that I think it's holding its value. I think 29 it was in this time period, and it could go down again. There's a halving next year. We'll see. Like, I agree with you. I think that we're in for some challenging times, as rates go up. And I think that even maintaining the rates at this level is still very challenging. And in this type of environment, risk premia will be higher and liquidity will be lower. And we're going to see liquidity go down and volatility will increase, more uncertainty. And so with all that phenomena going on, there's going to be some challenging times ahead. So I think that it's important during this time period just to be aware and to be educated on this. I have to quote Milton Friedman, the famous monetarist.
Do it.
Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, right? And when they increased the money supply, as they did, especially in 2020, with all that free money, and they brought the rates to negative, and it basically was negative rates, we're going to decrease the value, and the value is decreased significantly. And I believe that they will have to continue at some point with this massive debt that they have, and they don't stop the spending, and it's unsustainable. And so these are very
it's unsustainable. And I would also say it's undemocratic. I mean, nobody gets to vote for that. Like back in the day, allegedly, what used to happen with your tax bill is you would get a tax bill and it would have line item by line item what the government had spent your money on. Now it's just like they don't have to do that. They're like, oh, we're just going to print a load. So when at least the dollar was pegged to gold somewhat pre-1971, at least there was something to rein that in. Now it's just like we don't even need to ask the populace for permission. We just need Congress to vote. Well, I mean, Congress are all going to vote for stuff that suits them, and they want their board positions when they exit, their sort of role as legislators. So they're all in the pockets of large corporations that stand to make money from it. So there is nothing that is kind of holding back that rampant spending. And it's crazy to think that you and I have to work for something, i.e. money, that other people can print for free. I mean, that's just so inherently, obviously wrong and immoral and unfair. And what it does is it just disincentivizes productivity. Why would you bother trying hard and building a business if it's just going to get taken from you and somebody else can just print the money that you're having to earn? It's a crazy bad incentive system, and it has to collapse. It cannot be sustained because at some point, the productive members of society are just going to be like, ugh. I'm going to quote Ayn Rand, or maybe not quote her now, but she very famously wrote Atlas Shrugged. And the whole concept of that book is essentially that Atlas got sick of holding the world up and essentially shrugged and went, off you go, and the world comes crashing down. And that's the reality. Like the path that we are on that's where it gets to. And that's where you get this kind of, victimhood, I'm more hard done by than you are, I need handouts. Because why should people try? If you can get handouts of printed money because, I'm having a harder time than you are and I'm so disadvantaged, then, and that's not to say that there isn't a place for genuine charity and support for people who are really in need. But when you create an incentive system where you're more rewarded for not working than you are for working, that's just always going to be the outcome of that can't be anything but bad. It just can't.
Agreed. Well said.
Ran over.
Right. And I have to say, Krista, it's important. That's the whole point of our podcast, is to be exposing, we're independents and exposing the truth and what's really going on. And, it's not spoken about in the mainstream. Like you said, they're the ones that want to keep printing it. Now, you brought up a great point, and Safadine spoke about this, how when people get loans, that helps to inflate the money system, and it makes it lose its value. So what it does is the people who aren't getting in debt and saying, I'm going to hold my cash, I'm going to pay with cash, they're losing their value. So they're actually incentivized to take on debt. And the only way to counter this whole inflation is to keep taking on this debt. So it's like a continuation of debt. And it's like you want to just keep taking on this debt. And you also brought up productivity. And we're in a state of declining productivity, right? And
well, I mean, you say that we are and we aren't. Yeah, we are and we aren't, because automation is actually creating a lot more productivity. I mean,
that's what we
the
need.
Prime Minister.
That's a
Yeah,
solution.
but the UK,
it's automation, innovation, efficiency. We need that.
We do, but we only need it in some respects because the money's being devalued. I mean, Rishi Sunak, who is the UK Prime Minister, came out with a statement, and I read it on The Guardian the other day, and he said that pay rises, so there've been a lot of strikes in the UK with nurses and so on wanting pay rises, and he said pay rises should only be given for an increase of productivity. And somebody very rightly called him out on Twitter and said, this guy is economically illiterate. Like, has he not heard about inflation? So, I mean, if the government is printing money and, driving inflation, i.e. your wages are becoming worthless, to then turn around to you and gaslight you in that way and say, oh, but you should only get a pay rise if you're more productive. I mean, goddamn, and the guy was Chancellor of the Exchequer before that. I mean, it's not like he's economically illiterate. He understands the economy. So I would hazard a guess that he knows exactly what he's doing. But to make a statement like that is just so insulting to the intelligence and the lived experience of people going about their day and, trying to eke out a living, who are genuinely struggling. I don't know if we'd spoken about this before, but I co-founded an organization in the UK called Bitcoin Policy UK.
Yes, we're going to get into that. Yes.
We are.
Love it. Let's do it now. Let's do it now. Tell us about that.
Let's do that. Well, so when I was working for Bitcoin Collective, they were the ones that stood up the UK's first Bitcoin conference. And I was their community manager. And at the end of the conference, the CEO and I were sort of discussing what can we do, for the community going forward. And we kind of felt that there was a real momentum of people in the UK, and that actually there was a significant number of Bitcoiners that just didn't really have anything to sort of organize behind. And so eventually this ended up being spun out. So Jordan, the CEO of Bitcoin Collective, is now an advisor for Bitcoin Policy UK. So he's an advisor to the board. But basically, we spun this out as an organization that would focus on 3 pillars. So one is the policy piece, and that essentially entails responding to policy requests from Her Majesty's Treasury, from the government, from various, the regulators, the FCA. Then we've got the mining and sustainability piece. So that's about looking to educate businesses and the government about the benefits of Bitcoin mining and look at ways that we can leverage that. And then lastly, I'm leading it currently, temporarily, hopefully, the next gen work stream. And that's really about building up a talent pipeline for the UK. So our expectation as Bitcoiners is that, this industry is going to explode even more than it has right now. And we're going to need a huge amount of talent that is Bitcoin native, that really understands the technology and the industry and how the whole process and system works. So the idea is really to support the creation of a talent pipeline in the UK of Bitcoin native graduates who can essentially just move into that industry as soon as things explode. And we've partnered actually with, I don't know if you're familiar with Mi Primer Bitcoin, My First Bitcoin. It's an initiative that was actually started by a New Yorker, John Dennehy. So he's based out in El Salvador now.
Mm-hmm.
And when El Salvador made Bitcoin legal tender, he raced out there and was like, he's an activist from his background. And he was like, this is my chance to really make an impact in the world. And so he's working with an amazing lady called Dalia Platt, who is Colombian, and she's been a teacher all her life, but she's actually lived in Florida for the last 20 years. She's married to a Floridian, you'll be pleased to know. And she's designed this curriculum, which is a standardized curriculum for Bitcoin. And so it's completely open source. Anybody can take this curriculum. And we've signed up to this project that they're doing to have like, they're calling it lightning nodes, but it's not lightning nodes like the Lightning Network. It's not technical nodes, it's human nodes, which are either individuals or organizations. So Bitcoin Policy UK has committed to teaching 50 kids this program in the first 180 days of running it. So we've got a group of UK school teachers who are really like chomping at the bit to do this. End of this month, we're doing a 2-day session where one of those teachers who's already done 2 cohorts of students is going to train the teachers on how he delivered the program. And then they're all going to go out into their communities when school starts again in September, start their Bitcoin after school clubs or, you know, the lessons that they're doing, and they're going to incorporate all of this into that. So it's a really exciting project because it means that kids will become educated about this, you know, very, very early on in their journey. And in El Salvador, I think they've done, I can't remember how many kids they've taught, but it's hundreds that they've done. And there's other nodes in this organization. I was interviewing for my podcast the other day, Zusela Ramos. She's Honduran and she lives in Prospera, which is one of those free cities. So it's a free economic zone in Honduras on the island of Roatan. And she's done 3 cohorts already now. So she's taught a huge amount of kids. She's training teachers and upskilling them on it. So, you know, it's happening. It's happening. And it's, yeah, it's super exciting. So there's a lot of stuff like that going on. So, yeah, I mean, with Bitcoin Policy UK, we're just essentially trying to educate our, you know, legislators like our MPs, our members of parliament, educate business and provide support to the whole Bitcoin community so that they can help drive initiatives and they have an organization that will kind of support, you know, actioning that and promote what's happening in the UK. So that's my pitch.
I love it. And El Salvador schooling, that sounds amazing. That sounds really great. And I think that what you're doing with the Bitcoin Policy UK and educating, it's fantastic. I love how you segmented it into the grid. You talk about the mining sustainability part of it. And I think it's so important. We have wasted energy and we need to use the mining for the grids. It helps with rolling blackouts. A lot of times in California out west, they have issues with power. And I think that Bitcoin mining can help make that energy more seamless and more streamlined with working with the grid. And that's great that you have that part of it because energy is key. And it's, you know, I love Michael Saylor calls Bitcoin economic energy. And I do think that Bitcoin and energy go hand in hand and they're together. And so I love that you have that. And then the next gen, it's so important to educate the next generation and have them learn at a young age the importance of this. And so they're not conditioned to think in the old way of thinking
100%.
of money, right? They need to know what money really is. Money is a store of value. Money is used as a currency, and money should not be losing its value on you. And so that's so important that you educate.
It was interesting. It was interesting actually, because earlier you mentioned about shitcoins and an observation on that when I was working for the Bitcoin Collective, we were trying to bring a lot of university students to the conference. You know, we just thought this is like a new technology and it's going to be so exciting to them. And it was like pulling teeth. And they were very enamored of the crypto system. So a lot of the universities had crypto clubs, but it was patently obvious that the students didn't understand that Bitcoin is just in a class of its own. And for anyone listening, actually, just a quick sidebar, you know, Bitcoin is finite. It is not controlled by anyone. So there's no central controlling CEO. There's no central controlling foundation or consortium. and it's verified by, I think it's over 40,000 nodes. All the transactions are validated by over 40,000 nodes globally. So that stands in very, very stark contrast to every single other blockchain and altcoin, because they all have a central controlling authority, either an organization or an individual. They're often pre-mined. So, there'll be a very large pre-mine of the coins before they issue them to retail. And the whole kind of value prop for the most part is pump and dump. It's like spend a shitload of money on promoting these coins and then dump them onto retail. The pre-miners, who issue the coin, they clean up, they take their share, and then the coins inevitably, I don't know if I think there's maybe one coin that's an exception to the rule, which is Dogecoin. All the other ones have crashed. And as we know, like Elon Musk is always promoting Dogecoin, he's constantly shilling it. And that's kind of the exception that proves the rule. But you see Bitcoin consistently, sure, it has price swings, but it maintains its value. So what was interesting to me was that a lot of these students were very passionate about the crypto space. And I think there's like a number go up, I want to make a quick buck mentality there. But I also think that crypto has had a relentless marketing campaign to promote the various coins that have been issued. The other thing that we found was that many of the lecturers that were teaching at universities just had a visceral reaction to Bitcoin, with it being a scam, and their preferred topic or kind of categorization was blockchain. Like, blockchain technology is good, blockchain is useful. And so there's a huge education effort that needs to go on. I mean, it's insane just how effective the misinformation campaigns around Bitcoin have been. And one of the things that really attracted me to Bitcoin, having seen the kind of fraud and misbehavior in the financial markets, traditional finance, was just the integrity of the technology, the integrity of the technology and the integrity of the people that it attracts to this community. I mean, you have people in the Bitcoin community that just have extremely strong values. Like you said, they're thinking out long term, they're planning for their futures, they're planning for their kids, they passionately want to build a better world and do things that are right. So I just feel it's the most important thing I can do with my life is share what I've learned, educate other people, and really just help them cross the bridge into this world and understand that this technology is just it's more important than the fire. Sorry, I would say it's as important as fire, the wheel, all of these technologies that we look at, the printing press, where we're just kind of like, these were things that revolutionized humanity. That's Bitcoin. That Bitcoin should be up on that same level, 100%. Ran over.
I love that. And you have that passion, and I love that you want to enlighten and educate others. It's beautiful. I believe we're undergoing several revolutions right now, and Bitcoin and blockchain being one of them, and Internet of Things and AI is huge. I think that's a totally new level, and it will increase our productivity. Being in manufacturing, we've seen a steady decline. And the worker has changed. There's a mismatch between the employer and employee. And there's a lot of challenges going on in the labor force, a lot of new fees. And it's not just that higher fees. We have new fees and we have new charges. And it's just a dilution of value is what I call it. And I've used that term a lot, is that we're getting less output for every input. And so it's a very challenging time. And I think it's no better time than now to be enlightening and educating. And that's what our mission is. And that's the mission of this podcast as well. I want to go into the policy part of your Bitcoin policy UK.
Yeah.
I want to ask you about what's going on with UK post Brexit. Is there more opportunity now, do you see, with UK being able to adopt Bitcoin as a currency? Do you foresee that? You've lived there for quite some time, correct? You were living in London?
Yeah, I spent the most of London is the place that I've lived for most of my life.
Wow.
I now live in Canada, so it's actually been interesting to see the contrast between
you are the
two.
perfect person to ask. So tell us your experiences and what you think about UK and the adoption of Bitcoin.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. So I'm not going to delve too much into the nitty-gritty of the regulation because we have an extremely good policy person, Freddie New at Bitcoin
Mhm.
Policy UK, who writes all of our responses. And he's a lawyer by training, and he's been a
We
Bitcoiner
want
for
the
way
Cliff
longer than
Notes.
I have.
We want the Cliff
The
Notes
cliff
version.
notes. Yeah, so I mean, okay, so Brexit. So I voted for Brexit, and I was probably an early Bitcoiner before I knew that. And I was a bit of an outlier, I would say, in London, because generally, like London is populated by people who are much more to the left, I would say, so more left
Mhm.
wing. Um, and Brexit was seen as a right wing issue, which is somewhat ironic because, you know, the immigration that was coming with the freedom of free movement from the European Union was generally driving down wages for the poorest people in society. So it was like the builders, you know, the road workers, the nannies, they were the ones that were being most impacted for it. And so I found it somewhat ironic that, like, what I would often call champagne socialists were kind of like, oh, it's terrible, you know, we shouldn't exit the European Union. This is a racist thing, blah, blah, blah. And weren't really giving much thought to the economics actually of you know the people that were most impacted. And you know, probably if you're wealthy and you also feel that you have sort of, you know, kind of that you want to do the right thing by society, let's say in your mind, but you also don't want to spend a lot of money to have your home extension bill or your to hire a nanny, then yeah, I can see how you might fall on that side of the equation. My issue with Brexit really is that, you know, it was not implemented to the extent that it should have been. I think there was a great opportunity when we exited the European Union for the UK to become something like Singapore. And I think that there was such a battle to rein in that what was essentially the democratic vote of the people, that I think the opportunity that that presented hasn't been fully capitalized on. Now, my personal opinion, and I'm not going to speak on behalf of Bitcoin Policy UK, so views are my own. But, you know, our current Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, who was not elected, he was placed in as Prime Minister because essentially the party decided they didn't want to have the person that was actually elected through the agreed process, who was Liz Truss. So she lasted 1 month. They exited her because she was doing sort of trying to implement policies that in my mind were more kind of free market policies, and there was a lot of pushback on that because it, you know, it did cause some short-term economic problems, which I won't go into. But basically, Rishi Sunak has come out very vocally in support of crypto. So it's arguable whether he understands the difference between Bitcoin and crypto. I can't honestly say which it is, but from what he says publicly, you know, he wanted to roll out what he was calling Bitcoin, which I felt was actually a very dishonest term to use because it's a central bank digital currency, which, for
Mhm.
those who don't know,
Oh,
is a currency that is a token issued by the central bank that is controlled by the central bank. It's programmable money. So the government can decide to program it and say, well, you can't buy a steak this month because you've done your meat quota, or you can't fill your car up because we've
total
decided that, you
control.
know, you've total control. And so he calls it with this very cutesy, slightly patriotic sounding name of Bitcoin. But that's basically what he was shilling. And so I'm quite angry about that because I think that shows either a lack of understanding, or God forbid, he understands exactly what he's doing, in which case it's pretty damn sinister and something that the UK population should really push back against. But nonetheless, he has come out very vocally and said that he wants the UK to be a crypto hub. Now, what I will say is that they are trying to sort of bring in clarity with regulations in a much more assertive way, let's say, than the US is. So there's much less infighting. It's much more about, we think this is happening. How can we regulate it correctly and do things that will be helpful? Unfortunately, the FCA, you know, we're pushing out a new regulation which is around advertising crypto, and it has international reach. So the impact of that, as it seems, at least from how things are written, is that if you are promoting the purchase of Bitcoin or cryptos, and somebody outside of the UK can see it, so it's on the internet, it's on your website, that's, oh, sorry, somebody within the UK can see it, apologies. So say I'm an American company and I'm promoting, I don't know, cryptos or some exchange or some token. If a British person can see that, then it's caught by the regulation, and you're not allowed to do that. Essentially, you have to register with the FCA in order to promote those products. And it's a badly written rule, in my opinion, in my personal opinion, because it's very difficult to enforce. You know, I think I put something on LinkedIn the other day where I was like, you know, if I'm in Dubai, my business is registered in Dubai and my customers are in Dubai, but somebody in the UK happens to be able to see my website, why the heck should I be caught by a rule in a jurisdiction where I have no business and I'm not operating? So you could argue that it's not really correctly written, and also it's likely very difficult to enforce. So I think there are lots of things like that that are kind of working their way through the regulatory system that are just, you know, it's special interests, it's people not understanding the space very well and how it works. And there's a huge level of or lack of education, I think, in the legislative process about the differences between Bitcoin and crypto. And so we very often as an organization will say, well, look, we're in support of this as it relates to crypto, but we're not in support of it as it relates to Bitcoin because either it can't be implemented or it doesn't make sense, or these things are just completely different and they should be treated as such. So you can see all of that policy stuff on our website. If you go to bitcoinpolicy.uk/news, I think all of those kind of policy responses are in there. And I would encourage people to read through them and analyze them.
Very nice. Definitely going to add that website to the description so everyone can access that. They can just click right through. I love your website. I went through and I read through some of the news, and that's how I saw the different parts of the next gen, the energy, and the policy. And I was excited to ask you about policy. It's not too often that I have UK people on here. I hope to have more, but I'd love to learn more about that side of the Atlantic, and having your Bitcoin Policy UK. How exciting, real treat for all of us here to hear about what's going on in UK. So Krista, what do you think about the adoption? Thank you for all that. That was a great explanation. The adoption of Bitcoin compared to US and Canada. Do you think UK is making more advancements, more open to having it be legal tender?
Oh, oh, that's a hot button question, isn't it?
Just your opinion.
Yeah, I mean, my opinion. No, I mean, if you really want my opinion, is I think that I think Canada, the US, and possibly the UK as well. I mean, I'm very much a believer in some of the predictions, I guess, that the book The Sovereign Individual that was released in 1997, I think it was Jim Dale Davidson and something Rees-Mogg, I can't remember his name, but interestingly, the Rees-Mogg who co-wrote The Sovereign Individual, his son is now a member of the Conservative Party. He's in Parliament. So it's just quite interesting. I would love to be able to ask him his opinions about Bitcoin, because while The Sovereign Individual is not a Bitcoin book, it's kind of Bitcoin adjacent. But one of the things the Sovereign Individual book talks about is the fact that the sort of bureaucratic state currently has become too heavy on the producers and the society at large. And they draw the comparison with like the Catholic Church, you know, during the Middle Ages, and how the taxation that they were imposing on the populace and all of this kind of stuff just became too much for the strata of producers, if you like, to bear. And I think we're at that stage now. I mean, I'll be honest, what I see having moved to Canada is that there is, I think, a very high risk of provinces seceding from the union. And in Canada, unlike the US, there is actually a mechanism for that to happen. So there is a political mechanism in which provinces can do that. And I think certainly out in the Western provinces, that's looking more and more likely, just because of the policies that the government is implementing here. In the UK, we've seen some devolution already. So the UK doesn't have states. But, you know, we've seen regions like Wales and Scotland, for example, have become more autonomous. They've got their own parliaments. And what I suspect will happen is that as the fiat currencies just, you know, globally just increasingly get devalued and the whole thing just starts crumbling, regions that have some ability to be independent, either because they already have the legal structure or they're just culturally already, you know, they already see themselves as separate. I think that we're going to see them breaking off and becoming smaller citadels or smaller communities and smaller kind of mini regions, if you like. So I would suspect that Canada probably has a very high probability of being one of the first, I think, just because of the way the situation is here for many reasons. The US, I think, culturally especially places like Texas, have a very strong probability of it. But as I understand it from the research that I've done, the US doesn't have an existing mechanism. Like there is no function in the US by which a state can say, right, I'm going to start the process now of leaving the union. I think with the UK, we've already seen some of that separation, and there's a huge movement in Scotland to separate from the UK. And this has been going on for decades. So they want this independence ref. They had one a few years ago, a referendum, and they just remained in the UK. But I think if the UK economy starts tanking, and Scotland's not doing very well economically, by the way, so this is not to say that there's some really sort of, productive, wealthy region. But I think that the case will become stronger politically to say we should just chart our own course and separate. So if that happens, I think there's a very, very strong probability that countries start to see the value of Bitcoin and adopt a Bitcoin standard. I think we could certainly see that. And I think we're very likely to see that in other Latin American countries who are probably looking over at El Salvador and going, shit, GDP going through the roof. I think the first year after they had made Bitcoin legal tender, their tourism went up by 30%. Statistically, El Salvador is actually safer than Canada now as a country, which is freaking wild because that was one of the murder capitals of the world, 2 years ago. You'll start to see that game theory play out with countries saying, actually, you know what, I want a piece of that. And, we're gonna try and implement some of those policies and see how we do. And then it's just going to be a race. It's going to be a race to see who can mine the most Bitcoin. Let's be honest, the government's probably going to start printing fiat so they can buy Bitcoin. And then we'll see what impact that has. But I think it's going to be an extremely rocky period economically, politically. And, God help us that we come out the other side in one piece and in a better world. But I'm an optimist.
I can tell. I was just going to say, you're an optimist, and I love it. And I'm an optimist as well. I think we can, what we should call it? The orange wave. I think there's going to be an orange wave, right? It just came to me when we were talking. I was like, they talk about the blue wave, the red wave, but it's an orange wave. It's a global.
You need to trademark that. I don't know what you're going to trademark it.
I'm going to trademark it.
I love it.
I'm going to have to call my husband and say he does intellectual property sometimes, and I'm like, I gotta have to trademark it. So yeah, the orange wave. It's like a matter of just these countries are just going to start, and when it starts, it's just like technology. And I talked about this on another show. All these shows become like a blur. I'm like always talking on all these shows, and basically once you get like some catalyst, it's like some type of just one little, it's like a little something you need. It's all of a sudden it explodes. And it's like, it's just that little catalyst, that little, just igniting it, right? So it, like you said, once they start seeing that their currency is going down, they're just, and then they want more peacefulness. And that's another thing that Michael Saylor brought up, and all the Bitcoiners, as well as you mentioned, it's when you adopt this Bitcoin monetary system, it becomes more peaceful. There's less, less kind of theft. There's less type of fighting that goes on and wars. So with that in mind, it's like an adoption. It's not just money. And I always say that about Bitcoin. It's not just money. It's social. It's all these other elements to Bitcoin. It's like a mindset. And so once you start seeing that happen, it's like you just start having an orange wave, right? And so, we hope for the best, and we're both optimists. And I do believe that humanity will prevail. And, I also, when I spoke with an economist, a great PhD, he's in Madrid, actually, Dr. Daniel Lacalle. And he mentioned that he even said, being, more of a traditional in financial markets, and he's a CIO, he said that Bitcoin can coexist with fiat. And that's another way of looking at it, because I want to connect all people. And there are a lot of people who just can't see living in a Bitcoin standard right now. So what I say to those people is fiat and Bitcoin can coexist. And I think that's the first step. I think if we can accept having an alternative currency, an alternative asset class, such as Bitcoin, as part of currency, that would be a great step. So I'm hopeful that we can add that, and as legal tender here in the United States. I know there's some areas I know I spoke to someone in Austin who said that he lives the Bitcoin standard. But it's just an interesting idea. And I think that it's a bottom up movement. And I think that if people all come together and they say, you know, this is what we want as they get educated. And I always tell everyone it's about thinking for yourself. We're not here to brainwash you or condition you or tell you what to think. We want you to think for yourself. So we just lay out everything that we see. We share our knowledge, right, and our experience. And you think for yourself and you see for yourself what you feel that you need to do to prepare you and your family and for the future,
100%.
right? And I
I'm
think
curious.
it's
I'm curious.
clear.
Being in the US, like, what do you see about the sort of trajectory there? Like, do you see the likelihood of a splitting off of different states, for example? Is that something that you can see happening?
That's a great question. You know, for many years we talk about, you know, different parts of the US seceding from each other and different states pulling away. But, you know, it seems that we were talking more about that when we had Trump in office, I think, than lately. But, you know, I don't think, my personal opinion, I don't see it happening anytime soon, of any secession of any states. Like in Canada, the provinces are more like their own little separate sovereignties, it seems. While here, even though we're all a nation of states, I don't see anytime soon a state actually seceding from the rest of the country. And that's just my opinion. But they definitely have different vibes and different political views, different social views, from state to state. And like comparing Florida, for example, Florida versus New York, even though a lot of New Yorkers have moved to Florida, Florida is a vastly different environment. I mean, I grew up there, you know, as a child. It's tends to be, a lot of people have different views on Florida, but overall, I think that Florida tends to be a little more independent and different than other states. I mean, with COVID, I remember they weren't very strict. It was Ron DeSantis. They weren't very strict on their policies with masks and so forth. So they were a little different. And there are other states like that that tend to be a little more independent or different than others. But
Yeah, I think that's actually one of the beauties, though, of living in a large country that has these sort of separate fiefdoms, if you like, is that you can kind of vote with your feet as well. Like if you prefer the culture or the regulations or whatever in a different state or in a different province, you can move. And, you know, I'd say my observation with the UK is it's a fairly small island, and then you have the sort of Scottish, Welsh, you know, English split. But there isn't really much optionality to say, well, actually, I don't like how things are being run here. I want to stay in the same country, but I'm going to move to a different jurisdiction. So I just think that that's quite a, you know, with the US being such a vast
Oh,
geographical
yes, you
lump.
can definitely live in a very, I like that. You can vote with your feet. I like that one. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. If you go to a different part of the country, it'll be vastly different than other parts of the country. So yes, there's extreme, totally different sides of the spectrum, and optionality. That's a good word for where you live. So absolutely. And that's the beauty of, you know, we always complain as Americans. We say, oh, we have all this and that, but, you know, we have it pretty good here, right? And it's a great country. And, you know,
Yeah.
it's a good place.
It's
We
a
have a
great,
diverse group of people, and it's really a great place to be.
definitely. So I'm actually, from a policy perspective, I've been very interested to watch what's going on in the US, because you now have, so it's the mayor of Miami, it's Ron DeSantis, it's Vivek Ramaswamy, and it's RFK Jr. So you've got four candidates running for office, all of them vocally against CBDCs and vocally pro Bitcoin, which I think is just absolutely crazy, but awesome. And I would love to see the same thing in the UK. Firstly, just the same level of comprehension about Bitcoin, but secondly, just that, like, you know, vocal kind of outspokenness about these technologies and how they differ and why they're so important. I mean, you know, I feel like oftentimes America leads for the good and the bad, but you
Yes.
know, in this particular thing, I think they're really coming out of the gate with a strong kind of you know, position on that. And I think that speaks to also like how educated the US population actually is at this point with Bitcoin, because, you know, the candidates are taking on these policies because they're polling and they know that these are popular stances. And so many people hold Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies. But I know that in the UK, I don't think that this penny has quite dropped for the politicians yet, that it's like, some people are single voter, you know, single issue voters on this matter. And I think for me, I mean, as long as the candidate wasn't wildly like off-piste on something, I would be a single issue voter on that. Like if a candidate came out and said, running for the leadership of a party and said, I'm going to move the UK to a Bitcoin standard, I would probably vote for that party, like, because I think that that would be so beneficial for the country, for its economy, for the flourishing of society there, the education of kids, like, you know, the just the wealth of the country, that I just think it would almost override almost anything. So yeah, it's very interesting times. And I would say as well, this is something I hear a lot, and I think what's his name? Bruce Fenton, who was the guy that ran for the Senate in New Hampshire. He didn't get the seat. Have you interviewed him? You should interview him.
Oh,
I
that's a
love
good
him.
idea. I'll have to definitely hit him up then.
Yeah. Yeah, put him on your list. He's great. And he ran for the Senate. So he's been in the brokerage business for years. So you guys will have a ton to
I
talk
love
about.
that.
I think like 30 years or whatever, but he ran for Senate. He didn't win the seat. But, you know, he was sort of saying like people need to get active at a local level as well, like get active in your
Absolutely.
community. You know, the local kind of, you know, people that are being voted in, make sure that they're educated about it, that you're voting people in that have good policies. And I actually think that that's fantastic, because oftentimes when people look at a country level, they think that they can't have an impact. But, you know, we've seen in Bitcoin Policy UK, we have an incredibly engaged Bitcoin community. When we launched, I can't even tell you how many people reached out to us and said, can I just volunteer my time? And they were coming out of the woodwork from the craziest of organizations that you just would not expect, like people deeply entrenched in the education system, you know, people who involved in government work. And they're all kind of like, oh, wow, there's this thing that we can kind of convene behind now. And actually, all of those people are voting in their local politicians. Many of them know their local politicians. They're engaging with them on a regular basis. So I think that there is a huge opportunity just to educate at a grassroots level.
Exactly.
And
Grassroots,
once
absolutely.
100%. And then I think when politicians see that critical mass, which it will be a critical mass, because nobody crosses over into Bitcoin unless you're like someone weird like Nassim Taleb, who I think his brain short-circuited. But nobody crosses over into Bitcoin and then crosses back. They just don't. If you really understand this technology and what it means, and you really care about your kids' futures and about humanity, you don't ever go back to a fiat mindset. You just don't. So we're only going to grow a number.
Absolutely. I think that, like I said before, bottom up approach is key. And I talk about that in business, and I talk about that with invest in everything. I think it starts at the bottom level. And I think with the grassroots community, you know, I remember in high school, there was this bumper sticker I once saw. It said, think globally, act locally. And it
Yes.
applies here as well. So you start at, you know, with your local communities. And I think it's important to remain, you know, connected to the people in your community, and you stay at that level and you work from the bottom up. And I think that's great. And it's, you know, you target low hanging fruit. And I love that, you know, Dennis Porter was on the show. I'm going to be meeting with him again next month. And we're going to do a quarterly check-in with how everything's going on the legislation side for, you know, diminishing the discrimination of Bitcoin mining. And he had said that he's targeting the low-hanging fruits, and he's working at the state level, not at the federal level. You're working at the state level. You know, they tend to be more right-leaning states, not all, but overall the ones he's had the most success with. And he's working at that level. And then as you gain more people, then you get that orange wave, right? I'm going to get,
I
then you
love
get
it.
that, right? Then you get that. And so that, I think that's the right way to work. So we just collectively just work that way and educate.
Yeah, no, I was going to say he's awesome. I met him at Bitcoin Miami, and we had a chat at one of the mining events, and he was just talking about, you know, how we can approach things with Bitcoin Policy UK. And he's very laser focused, systematic, and I think his approach is absolutely correct. I mean, it worked for marijuana legislation in the US, you
He's
know, where
using
it's
that as
like,
a model. Yes.
And I think that's
Brilliant.
100% right. And again, it goes back to this whole thing with like there's strength in decentralization. You know, the US is decentralized, and there is something about that structure that it's very messy, but it makes it very resilient, because now you've got states like Texas, states like Wyoming, states like Montana that can say, hey, do you know what? This is great for our economy and we're going to adopt it. And then it just proves the concept. And now everybody else is looking at it going, hey, actually, I might want some of that action. Like, this is pretty amazing. And I hope that we'll see a similar thing in Canada. I mean, Alberta has a huge energy industry, and, you know, lots of active Bitcoiners who are like trying to implement mining technology. There's a huge amount of nuclear here. I spent like an hour last week chatting to, he's called Nuclear Bitcoiner on Twitter, but in the Bitcoin space, who's Canadian, about like how that all works, and how that industry works, and how it can, you know, benefit from Bitcoin mining. And so, you know, I'm having conversations with people about all of this stuff all over the world, and it's just, you can really feel just how it's happening. It's just happening. And it's like, I don't know. I feel like this industry, for me, I grew up when the internet became a thing, and I'm sure you and I are probably similar ages, so we've got a similar kind of perspective on it. But it feels to me like the internet on steroids. Like, the internet felt super exciting, but this just feels like world changing. It's just it's so
A
incredible,
revolution.
and
It's a revolution for sure. And
a peaceful revolution.
right, exactly. You know, I love Bitcoin mining for also the orphan wells, the methane gas. So it's great for the environment. And it's also great
100%.
financially because it helps create jobs in rural areas. So it's good. I always say it's good for the environment and your wallet. You know, it's good for all the taxpayers. And that's another thing with all this debt that's going on with the governments and inflation, it's the taxpayers who are paying the price, and it's the people.
Yeah.
We don't ask for, we don't want all this debt, but we have, like you said, we don't vote for it. However, we end up paying for it. So there has to be
Yeah.
another way. We have to think different. And that's the key, is to think different and to start thinking more about solutions. And I think this is a solution. You know, challenges
Yeah.
bring opportunities, and here we are discussing, you know, solutions to a lot of these issues that we have that are only going to get worse in time. And so I want to talk
Yeah.
about your Access Tribe Limited. And I think what you did there is amazing. And this is all in line
Thank
with
you.
what we're discussing. You're welcome. In how you are educating. It's inspiring, educating, connecting. And that's the key. And that's exactly what so that your business that you created is exactly what we've been talking about, because we're inspiring, and it is inspiring. It's amazing. It's like an orange light goes off, and then we're educating. And then, like we said, bottom up movement, we're connecting with people, and it's about connection. So what challenges, if any, are you facing with that movement to enlighten women?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a journey of like understanding really how to crack that market, I think is part of it. So initially, I kind of came into the Bitcoin space and I just saw that there were a lot of men, but I've worked in traditional finance for 20 years. So to me, that's not really like an uncomfortable environment. You know, I was just like, whatever, you know, it's a more technical, you know, thing, perhaps tends to attract people who are more interested in things rather than people. And I think that, so a couple of things really. I discovered that there were far more women in this space actually than I had realized.
Yes.
And every time I'd interview one for my podcast, I'd get introduced to another two or three. And I just started to discover that there was this whole, like, I don't want to call it a subculture, but, you know, there is this network of women that are there. But what I noticed was they don't tend to go on podcasts. They don't tend to shout about what they do. Some of them are like, I'm not going to name her, I'm not going to dox her, but or call her out. But, you know, there's one woman that I interviewed who is building just this unbelievable company. And she's just doing something that I think is actually one of the most interesting companies I've seen, not just in the Bitcoin space, but full stop. And she was really reluctant to come on. She'd never done a podcast before. And, you know, what she's doing is incredible. And I was just like, damn, you need to tell people about this. So that was one thing, really. And, you know, my previous role, I had a background running accelerator programs and working in corporate innovation. And so I worked with investors a lot and with early stage companies. And I was just like, I don't think that the investment community understands like, what's going on here? You've got this like little handful of really kick-ass VCs, but you've got like Folger Ventures, you've got Stillmark, Elise Killian runs that, so founded and run by a woman. You've got Ego Death Capital, Jeff Booth and Andy Pitts, VC, which is investing in some unbelievable companies. And I was just like, the wider investment community just seems completely blind to this. And so I start reaching out to some of my contacts, and one particular organization is a really large network of angel investors in the US, and they only invest in female founders. It's a whole variety of different businesses, like they've got pharma, trucking, all sorts of stuff, but they only invest in a company that has it has to have a prominent woman who has a voice in the C-suite. Essentially, that's their criteria. And they asked me to come and do a talk about Bitcoin because they said, gosh, like this isn't even on our radar. And so I came and gave this talk, and I shall get onto that about the platform, but that's going to be available on my membership platform for anybody to view. So I've recorded a voiceover basically for that presentation. Specifically, I think it's of interest to angel investors, but it could be anyone that's interested in Bitcoin. But the reaction was just overwhelming. I mean, like one person messaged me and said, that's the best talk I've heard in like years about any kind of new technology. And they were just like, this is incredible. And I thought, it's not because I'm some kick-ass public speaker. I think it's just this thing really stands on its own, and it's just so incredible, and just not enough people understand it. And then I had a whole bunch of friends that were interested in Bitcoin, and they said to me, oh, can you do a training session? Can you do this? Can you do that? And so I started off doing educational sessions just to see what the response was. And it was just interesting because I had friends who were economists messaging me when I did the section about Bitcoin mining. And they said, oh my God, like this is one of the few presentations I've gone to where I've actually learned something. I've actually come out of it with some like really new knowledge. And eventually I was just thinking, how can I bring everybody together? So I do lots of stuff on social media. I interview lots of women in the space to kind of highlight them. But I really realized that like my kind of network is professional women, typically from traditional finance. And I wanted to build something that I would have wanted at the start of my Bitcoin journey, where I would have had a community of girls like me that I could just reach out to and chat to and ask questions for. And so I've created a platform which is live now. So you can access it at accesstribe, accesstribe.com / now hang on a second, I'm going to get this wrong. Let me get the URL correct. But basically, yeah, so it's accesstribe.com / membership. And so that will take you to a page where you can essentially register for this platform. And it's just got like, presentations. It's got fun stuff like Bitcoin movies, like what movie should you watch in the Bitcoin space. And by the way, there's a massively active community of filmmakers in Bitcoin. Some of them I've interviewed for my podcast, so I've posted some of those. Also just pieces that I have written specifically for investors about Bitcoin companies. So doing analysis on interesting early stage startups in the space. And yeah, it's just basically a place where people can go, they can connect with other people. There are chat rooms where they can chat with other women in this space. And I'm kind of creating content really for 3 different types. So one is general, anybody that's interested in the Bitcoin space and primarily wants to connect with other women. Investors, so people who are angel investors or in the investment space, but are not familiar with this technology and would like to understand what's actually going on in this ecosystem. And I really hope and encourage that many of them will think about investing, particularly in companies where there are women involved, if there are, ones that they're interested in. And then the other piece is really for founders. So one of my big passions has been, my career supporting early stage founders. And I'm gonna like commit to something here, because I'm putting together an accelerator program for female founders in the Bitcoin and Lightning space that's going to be held online. So that's going to kick off next year. But I'm doing a taster one for members of the Access Tribe platform. And that is essentially a 6-week course with a whole bunch of prominent, mostly female, 90% female Bitcoiners coming to talk about how they've built Bitcoin businesses, or about the Bitcoin technology, about how to market Bitcoin businesses. And the idea is really just to give members access to that as a learning tool, so that they really understand the potential of this technology. And then if they want to, they can then apply for the accelerator program next year, which will be a fully fledged program, with in-depth kind of training on how to build a business and exposure to this technology and so on. So yeah, so it's accesstribe.com / membership for people that want to access that. And then I've also done a discount code actually that you can put in your show notes. So it's ROSHOW, all capital letters, and they get a 15% discount on subscription as well.
Right.
So if they want to access that content, it will all be on there.
Is it did you make it the Row Show or you just made it Row Show?
I just made it ROSHOW because I figured it was less
Okay.
what
I'll
do you
put
call
that in
it?
there. Yeah, the
Less
Row
words.
Show promotion code. Exciting. So when I met with Sue Ennis, the VP of Hut 8 Mining, she told me that her experience has been, I asked her this question about women in finance and business and Bitcoin, and she said that Bitcoin is much more inclusive than the traditional financial world. And that was her experience. Is that yours as well then?
She is 100% spot on. And I wish that more, but kudos to her. I didn't hear that. I saw some clips of that interview, but I didn't watch the whole thing. Kudos to her for calling that out because that is so bang on and so true. So my experience coming into the Bitcoin space, it's not some bro club. These guys are so supportive. They're your champions. They're inclusive. I've just had the best experience. And look, I mean, I enjoyed my life in TradFi. I loved just bantering with the boys, and I thought that was really fun, and I enjoyed that environment. And I didn't find it, particularly oppressive in any way. But I will say that the Bitcoin community is entirely different. And the level of integrity of the people that you meet in this community, they're the kinds of people that you can just trust, you would trust your kids with. I don't want to recommend that anyone lets a Bitcoiner babysit their kids that they don't know. But just really, really phenomenal, high integrity people. So oh my God, I am so glad she said that. That is so, so true. So true.
That's awesome to hear. Yeah, I've noticed the same as well. It's a wonderful community of people, and everyone's so helpful, and they embody that abundance mindset. Everyone's out to help each other. It's really nice. I mean, of course, like Dennis Porter said, you get some bad apples in there, and then it makes everyone, think, negatively about the whole community. But it's not like that. Nothing's perfect, but overall experiences have been great, and the inclusiveness is just wonderful. So kudos to you for building
Yeah.
that platform. I guess that means that no men are allowed. Is that true?
I mean, oh God, I thought I'm going to get asked this, and I thought there's so many jokes I can crack here. Like if you put on a dress, you can get a membership. I don't know. Do you know what I mean? I was like,
Uh-huh.
I really don't know. I mean, at the end of the day, anybody can register for it, so knock yourself
That's
out. But
yeah.
just know that it's going to be a very female-heavy environment, and that's the audience that we're going to kind of cultivate. So, yeah, I mean, I think yeah, I can't stop a man from registering. So if he wants to have a peek and see what we're talking about, he's very welcome.
Exactly. That's
But
so
he just
nice.
might not.
I have
There,
to say,
there will be a lack of steaks, gym pictures, bone broth.
that's funny. I think it's so wonderful that you've chosen to work with the community of women and you're help build that community and trying to bridge and bring them over. Like you said, you had great statistics earlier in the show, how they're involved with the consumer spending 85%. So why aren't they involved in the Bitcoin community as much? So, and they are part of financial decisions. They are part of spending. So they should be enlightened to money being Bitcoin and Bitcoin being part of money. So it's so awesome. Thank you
Yeah.
so much for everything you do, Krista. And thank you so much for being here on the show. I enjoyed talking about money with you and UK and all your wealth of experiences and all that you're doing. I wish you much success with everything. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on. And I think you accosted me at Bitcoin Miami and just said, can you come on my show? So thank you for doing that and just having the chutzpah to just walk up to people and be like, hey, come and talk
That's
to
me.
me.
That's me. Like you said, you were always in a world surrounded by a lot of men, and same as I. I mean, I'm the same way, being in manufacturing, commercial real estate, financial markets, and it's just commonplace. So I always go out and talk to people, and that's just who I am. So I'm really happy I came out to you and introduced myself and asked you to be on my show. I know you had a little special pizzazz about you. And so you've definitely done some great things. Anything else you'd
Well,
like to
thank
add
you.
that I left
I
out?
mean, Not really. I mean, I would just like to say thank you for blazing a trail as well. I mean, I just think, it's yeah, I think people should really know that like life is short. We're only here for a short period of time, and don't hesitate to do stuff. I mean, there's yourself, there's people like Nat Brunel, I mean, there's so many people out there that I could call out, and women that are just doing incredible stuff. Fred
Yes.
Thiel is interesting. So people don't know this about Marathon digital assets. Like, I think it was Vanguard. I hope I'm not misquoting this, but I think they invested 600 million in them. I think it was 600. Maybe I'm misquoting that number. People think that TradFi isn't in this space. They are. Like, they really, really are. You just don't see it. You see the BlackRock ETF application and all of that kind of stuff being very headlined. But you have companies in this space that are traditional finance that are pouring money into it. So,
Absolutely.
ladies, please, I'll just say, get your asses over here because we're all having a party. It's awesome. There's so much cool stuff going on, and you're missing out. And you're not going to be as rich as the boys in like 10 years' time. So do it. That's what I'd say on my final note.
That's it. That's the Barbie Bitcoin, or the Bitcoin Barbie. That's it. And then she's,
Be a Bitcoin Barbie.
I love it. I love it. Thank you so much, Krista.
Thank you, Ro.